Hello, this is Mara Jane, and you're listening to The Unseen Perspective. Hello, and welcome back to The Unseen Perspective. I am your visually impaired host, Mara Jane. I didn't release an episode last week. I'm sorry about that. I have no excuses, at least not any good ones. But here I am, back again with something that I hope will make up for it, because Star Wars Day, May the 4th, was 2 days ago, so I'm going to do a special edition where I talk about Star Wars. So, I know this is a blindness podcast, and trust me, I will connect it back to that. But one of my interests as a human, not just as a blind human, is Star Wars. And I love Star Wars, and I have since, 2017. So, yeah, I'm surprised I haven't worked it in yet, but here we are, episode 22. So, some things that I have on the agenda to talk about today include Rogue One, which I watched yesterday, and it was better than I remember, so that's cool. Or 2 days ago, I guess, by the time this is released. And then blindness as it relates to the Force. I also want to talk about some audiobooks because, I read or listen to a lot of audiobooks, and a lot of the books I read or listen to are Star Wars books. So, yeah. Oh, I also read Braille Star Wars books, so I can talk about that as well. Before we get started, though, I want to give a huge shout out to my very favorite Star Wars podcast, Aggressive Negotiations. If you don't know who or what that is, you should go listen to it. It's from the Nerd Party Network, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. I've been listening to them for as long as I can remember, and I remember emailing them once. It was middle school, and I was talking about how I loved their podcast and how it gave me something better to do than be made fun of for being blind or something, which that's really dramatic, but whatever. I was really excited because they read and responded to my email on a podcast episode, and that made me really happy. But middle school was rough for me, but I wouldn't say it was primarily because of bullying. In fact, I don't remember being bullied much at all. It was more of a typical middle school issues, exclusion, emotional problems, things like that. But it was, made worse probably, or at least a different experience because of my blindness. So it was nice to have that podcast as a source of comfort, and also just being reassured that there were people who did have the same interests as me. And it was just fun to listen to. It's just a good podcast. So I would strongly recommend, and I'm doing a lot better than I was in middle school, but I still love this podcast because it's a good podcast. So without further ado, let's get into our discussion on this podcast about Star Wars. So, if any of you have not seen Rogue One, there is, I believe, the first canon representation of blindness in Star Wars. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Chirrut is a guardian of the Wills, and he is completely blind. So he's not a Jedi, but he is kind of Jedi adjacent. He's very connected to the Force, and obviously that comes with the territory of protecting the temple and the Kyber crystals. So he doesn't carry around a lightsaber or anything. He's not a Jedi. He has a staff, and he kind of wears these flowy red robes. I love his wardrobe. It's so fun. But he is blind, and that is a pretty significant step for the Star Wars universe, because we don't get a lot of blind representation, at least not accurate blind representation, in the media, so in books, movies, TV shows, and all that. But that actually is something I want to talk about on the podcast, is watch shows and read books and all that with blind people in them, and kind of discuss how accurate that portrayal is. Portrayal, not betrayal. But yeah, so you can look forward to that in the future. We can all look forward to that in the future. And I will definitely talk about Chirrut, but today I just want to talk about, that connection between Star Wars and blindness, which is very cool. And it's not the only connection. I will get to another connection later. But this is a very cool connection He's also just a very cool character, blind or not. And I really like how his kind of faith in the Force leads him or guides him in place of his sight. And that's even, it kind of goes beyond sight. So I myself am a devout Catholic. So this obviously isn't the same thing at all. But it there's a good, it's an idea of faith and, you know, being led blindly because we walk by faith and not by sight, which is kind of metaphorical, but in cases like mine and this character and, blind people all over the place, it is very literal. So, you know, I was talking to, actually, I don't think I've ever discussed this with anyone before. I was writing about it, but I cannot see stars. I can see some things, but I cannot see stars. So I was thinking one time about, looking up at the night sky with someone and being like, oh, aren't those beautiful stars? And they would be like, yeah, like they're really gorgeous, whatever. And I would be like, well, guess what? I cannot see them. I just know they're there and I know they're beautiful because, testimonies and, science, all that. So I have sufficient reason to believe that those stars are there. So for me, it's the same thing with God and with my Catholic faith. So just because you can't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist or doesn't mean it's not a big part of your life, like my example with the stars. And so we see that with Chirrut with the Force, and I think it's just a very cool representation of that connection between blindness and faith. So there's this one really cool scene where he's like, there's a bunch of crossfire and he's walking, he's like, I'm one with the Force and the Force is with me, and he's walking through this like melee of fighting and blaster bolts and nothing hits him, and he flips the switch, saves the day, allows the rebels to communicate with each other with the Death Star plans. It's really awesome. But yeah, and he dies after that, which is really sad, and I'm sorry if you haven't seen Rogue One, but come on, get with it. So, everyone dies in that movie, but he has this heroic moment that is like a pivotal moment in the movie, but also a key representation of blindness and his faith in the Force, which I think is super cool. And like I said, that movie in general is better than I remember. Like, I don't remember enjoying it that much the first time I watched it, but I was also really young when it came out, so that makes sense. But now that I'm older, now that I'm like a full-fledged Star Wars nerd, I feel like I can appreciate it more. But like I said, that is not the only blind representation that we get in Star Wars. It's the only blind representation that I know about that is in canonical Star Wars. But I really liked this series when I was younger called Jedi Apprentice, which is a book series, but it's Legends, which means that it's not part of the canon of Star Wars. It's just kind of extra things that may or may not be true in the Star Wars universe. So it was this really long series that I still haven't finished because it's like 20 books, and they only had like the first 10 books on Bookshare, which I'm kind of upset about. But I think there's a way you can like request books to be put on Bookshare, but I haven't figured that out yet. So I need to do that sometime soon. But anyway, I read like the first 10 of these books at least once each, or at least twice actually, probably. But there's this character in them named Tal, and like Tahl, and she's a Jedi, and she's actually Qui-Gon Jinn's love interest, so that's interesting. But she gets imprisoned on this planet and tortured, and this causes her to be blind. They blinded her, which, how rude, but whatever. So she is now completely blind, and she has that experience of, connecting more deeply with the Force with the lack of her vision. But also, the books talk about how she connects more to her other senses. So this is a common misconception that I believe we've talked about before on this podcast. When you are blind, it's believed that your other senses are heightened, which is sort of true, but it's not 100% true. Like, it's not like you lose your vision and then your other senses just get better. It's more of you're forced to focus more on those senses, which can create the illusion of them getting better, but really it's just a focus issue. So when you're focused, and you can do this, whether you're disabled or not, but once you focus more on a certain sense, like your hearing or your touch or even your sight, for some people, you are, actually for me that's true too, because I do have some vision, but when you focus more on a particular sense, you're able to use that sense to a fuller potential, which is very cool. So another misconception about blindness is that we are all musically inclined, which that would be great, but that is also not true. But our quote unquote heightened hearing, or that extra focus that we have on our hearing, allows us to have the potential to, be musically talented. So that's a cool thing. Like, I have a friend who can just like hear pieces of music and then immediately play them on the piano. That is not because he is blind or because of his heightened sense of hearing. That is just a skill that he has, which I'm totally jealous of. But I can learn things by ear because I have to, but it's not that, like, perfect. So, another thing that I wanted to talk about, kind of segueing from tall, is the relationship between blindness and the force. So, whether or not you are blind when you're born, or like you obtain, that's not the right word, you lose your sight, like partially through life, there is, I feel like, this very cool idea of what happens to your relationship with the Force as a Jedi or just as a regular human being in the Star Wars universe if you are blind. So I've done a lot of thinking about this personally because I'm a Star Wars nerd, but I feel like if you have some sort of sensory loss, for instance, blindness, you kind of have an advantage if you're a Jedi, because I remember in A New Hope when Obi-Wan is training Luke with the lightsaber and he has to like deflect the laser beams, he puts like this mask over his head because sight can be like distracting. It can deceive you. So the Force is more of a feeling thing rather than a sight thing. So when that sense of sight is taken away, you are able to become more connected with the cosmos and the things around you and actually be a more effective Force user, which I think is wild. And in the Jedi Apprentice series that I was talking about earlier, they actually have you blindfold yourself, or they blindfold you and they have you fight like with lightsabers. And I think this is a very interesting exercise because it highlights the connection between that loss of sight and sensitivity to the Force. So I think that allowing yourself to not just trust your physical experiences, but also like your connection to the galaxy spiritually, I think that's a really cool way to look at things. And I think that's a very important and a very interesting side to the Force and to the Star Wars universe that a lot of people tend to ignore, even though the Force is a very spiritual thing. So I think it would be very interesting if there was not necessarily a movie, but maybe a TV show or a book that would explore more deeply the connections between a lack of sight or some sensory loss, that connection with the Force, and how Jedi and regular humans in the Star Wars universe go about their lives with that loss of sight or whatever sense it is, and their connection to the Force related to that. I think that it would be very cool to see more I think it would be very cool to see more blind people in the media in general, but more blind Jedi, I think, would be super awesome. More blind Force users. I think that's something we need in our lives, but also, like, Jedi or characters with other disabilities like deafness or even like neurological disabilities, I think that would be super cool. Maybe I should get on that, I'm a writer. But yeah, I think it's a tragically unexplored area of the Star Wars universe, and I'm just rambling now. I probably sound like a total nerd, but that is okay, because I am very happy with my nerdiness. Oh, this is not Star Wars related, but if you're watching this on YouTube, you can maybe see my shirt. It says Woodridge on it. So, what is Woodridge? Woodridge is a band that my brother's roommates and other friends are in, and they are excellent. They write very great music, and they sound very good, and they are on Spotify. So, if you have Spotify, I would strongly recommend following them and listening to their music. And if you can, if you're in Manhattan, coming to their concerts, because they are a very talented group of people and they make wonderful music. And they have a very cool logo that is this bar stool on fire, because apparently they got free bar stools at one of their concerts and set them on fire. And that was their first album cover. So, yeah. But my brother is actually designing a wooden sign that has that design like etched into it, which it's not completed yet. It doesn't have the fire yet, but it looks super cool. He's very talented as well. But that's another thing, is accessibility in wood engravings. So I love laser engravings because you can feel them as well as see them, and not to mention the smell is excellent. Burnt wood. Ah. Okay, sorry, that was not Star Wars related at all. But back to our Star Wars discussion. I love to read, and primarily I read in either Braille or audio format. So I've read plenty of Star Wars books in my time, and I don't think any of them have been in print. I think I tried to read Kenobi by John Jackson Miller in print, and I made it like 3 paragraphs before I was like, no. And then I read it in Braille. But yeah. Oh, yeah, I read that last year. It was a really good book. I would strongly recommend. It's Legends, I think. But these books, and their accessibility on Bookshare and on Bard and on other services that are accessible to people with disabilities is excellent. I am so very grateful for the people who allow that to happen. The people that read audiobooks, like, oh, lifesavers. But some of them are more interesting than others, because I remember me and my friend Brooke, who has been on this podcast before, were listening to an audiobook of Revenge of the Sith because, for some reason I love the novelizations of the prequels, and the impressions of the characters are really funny. And yeah, I remember, I think we called someone one time and just like played that to confuse them. We are so strange. But I cannot tell you enough how much I love Braille and audiobooks, because without that, like, my reading life would be very difficult, and I am, that's a big part of my life. So if you're listening to this and you have any sort of correlation or contribution to the production of these accessible media types, thank you so much. You are loved. So very much. I appreciate your services. But that's pretty much all I have to talk about today. But hopefully we'll talk more about Star Wars in the future. But until then, you can follow us on Instagram at the Unseen Perspective 2024, or you can DM and email us with episode ideas or any feedback that you have at the Unseen Perspective 2024 at gmail.com. We are available on Spotify and YouTube. We would appreciate if you would follow or subscribe in your respective podcast app. And tune in for further episodes or catch up on older episodes if you so desire. And thank you for listening to this week's episode. And a belated May the 4th be with you. Today's the 6th, so happy Revenge of the 6th. I don't know. But until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful morning, evening, day, night, whenever you're listening to this. And I will see you next time. Bye!